Уважаемые коллеги, дорогие друзья, прежде всего от имени всех жителей
Colleagues, friends, first and foremost, on behalf of the residents of the Volga region and my own behalf, allow me to welcome the participants and panelists of the traditional Russian-American conference, the Fort Ross Dialogue.
2020 год
This year
столкнул наши страны и наши народы
has made countries that our peoples face an unexpected global challenge,
и жизненный уклад,
changed our lives,
скорректировал все наши планы.
disrupted all of our plans.
И в этой связи особо отрадно, что несмотря
In
на
this regard, it is specifically rewarding that in spite of all the
российско-американский
obstacles, the Russian-American dialogue
а его
keeps on
проводником
going,
вновь
channeled
выступает
again
собравший всех нас
by
представительный форум.
this well-attended forum.
Сегодня, как никогда, остро
Today,
приходит осознание того,
it is specifically poignant that we realize that tackling such challenges can only be
выступив
done through joint efforts. We need to build a united front to address this. This is our key
в
priority.
условиях, диктуемых текущей санитарной
The current epidemiological
все
situation
больше внимания на всех
calls
уровнях,
for greater focus
начиная
at all
уделяться
levels
базовым составляющим.
on the fundamentals,
Это общественному здоровью,
namely
экологии
public health,
и вопросам
environment,
природопользования.
and the use of natural
Наши предки
resources.
проявляли
Our
себя в
forefathers
качестве первоклассных.
were first-class architects of ecosystems.
Они приучали природу,
They tamed
преобразовывали ее
and
так,
stewarded
чтобы
nature
она
to
помогала им
satisfy
удовлетворять
their
потребности в
need
еде,
for food and shelter,
а значит,
which
создавали
means
комфортные
that they
условия
created comfortable and
существования
convenient living
и
conditions
жизнедеятельности
for
населения.
themselves and their
И
people.
сегодня в новых коронавирусных
Today,
реалиях мы
given the
должны
new coronavirus realities, we must continue in the spirit of rational use of natural resources and environmental security.
рационального решения
The
данных
absence
вопросов
of
невозможно
effective
гармоничное
solutions here
социально-экономическое развитие
prevents a harmonious social
При
and
этом
economic
особое
development of any
внимание
country.
должно
At
уделяться
the same time,
консолидации всех уровней.
special attention must be paid to consolidation at all levels, the government and
Российская
civil
Федерация на
society.
текущий момент вносит
Russia
существенный
today
вклад в
is making a
сохранение
significant
и
contribution to
поддержание
preserving
природного баланса планеты.
biodiversity on the
На
planet.
государственном уровне реализуется национальный
At the
проект
state
«Экология»,
level, the Environment National
направленный на
Project
улучшение
is being
экологической
implemented
обстановки в стране
to improve the
и
environmental situation
предусматривающий
in the country.
сокращение объемов
And it calls for
загрязнений,
cuts
улучшение состояния
on
ресурсов,
emissions,
обеспечение
improvement
защиты
of
людей
natural
и
resources,
представителей
protecting people, as well as flora and fauna.
Мы, как представители региональной власти,
We,
также уделяем
as regional
данным вопросам
authorities, also care about these
первоочередное
issues a lot.
Вологодская область занимает
The
площадь
Volga region has an
144,5
area of
квадратных километров
144.5
и
thousand
является
square
одним из
kilometers,
крупнейших
and as such, it
субъектов
is one of the biggest regions of the Russian Federation.
Площадь земельного фонда
Our
Вологодской
region's
области
area
составляет
is thus
14,5 миллиона гектаров.
14.5 million hectares.
И если говорить о структуре,
To give you
то
a
основную часть
breakdown,
территории,
the
именно
main part of this
79,5%,
chunk of this area,
занимает земли лесного
79.5%,
фонда.
is forests.
11,5%
11.5%
сельскохозяйственного назначения,
is agricultural lands,
5,8%
5.8% reserve lands, and 3.2% lands of other categories,
земли населенных пунктов,
including municipalities,
и особо охраняемых территорий.
industrial lands, and specially protected
С
areas.
2012 года
Since
в регионе реализуется государственная
2012, the
программа
region has been
охраны окружающей
implementing
среды,
the government program
воспроизводства
titled
и рационального
Environmental
использования
Protection,
природных
Reproduction, and Rational Use of
В ее
Natural
рамках
Resources.
уделяется внимание
It
следующим аспектам: вода,
focuses on the following aspects:
охрана и
water,
развитие животного мира,
protection
экологическая
of
безопасность
wildlife,
и рациональное
environmental
природопользование,
security, and
а
rational
также предотвращение
resource
загрязнения
management, as well as
окружающей среды.
preventing pollution.
Аналогичные экологические программы
Similar
действуют
environmental
и на
programs
муниципальном уровне.
are active at the municipal level.
Значительное внимание в регионе уделяется
A great
превентивным мерам, направленным на
emphasis
предотвращение возникновения лесных
in the
пожаров.
region is made on preventing
Благодаря
wildfires.
комплексу
A
реализованных
number
в 2020
of
году нам удалось
efforts we've
добиться существенных
made
результатов.
allowed us to see very tangible results
Не
this
было
year.
зарегистрировано ни
There were
одного
no
крупного лесного пожара,
major
а
wildfires
также
this
не
year
было
in our
допущено
region's
возникновения
forests,
чрезвычайных ситуаций.
and there were no
связанных
emergency
с природными
situations
пожарами.
related to wildfires.
Все возникающие очаги были
All
ликвидированы в течение
wildfires
первых
were
суток после
extinguished within
потопления,
24 hours after
а
detection,
63%
while
пожаров
63% of fires were extinguished before
0,1
they
гектара.
reached an area of 0.1 hectares. The region is pursuing an ambitious reforestation campaign. In 2020, reforestation efforts covered an area of 80,000 hectares, which is 6% above the target. At the same time, the forest preservation indicator of the Environment National Project, specifically as set for the Volga region, calls for reforesting 86.6% of the logging area, and this figure has been met. I must mention specially protected areas in the region. Their network has 199 sites with a total area of around 140,000 hectares. They include two federal-level territories, the Darwin Reserve and the Russian North National Park. 179 of them are region level. The remaining 18 are local level. This year, the region implemented a massive campaign to initiate amendments to the federal legislation to transfer the Russian North National Park from federal to regional and municipal property. Currently, the bill is being considered by Russia's parliament. These amendments will allow us to conduct economic activity in this area, while at the same time ensuring the main function of the park, preserving rich cultural, historic heritage of these lands. Another timely area of work tied into environmental security, quality of life, is fostering an environmentally sensitive culture. We engage regional and municipal authorities on this, cultural organizations, the mass media, public groups. We conduct dozens of events every year to enhance environmental awareness for people of all ages. For example, this year, saw the project Environment Through Children's Eyes, and a regional environmental conference titled Saving the Environment and Cultural Heritage of the Volga region was held. On top of that, a region participated in Water of Russia, a nationwide effort to clean up coastal areas and water bodies. Educating people about the environment is one of our top priorities. Being environmentally aware is the foundation of our future green wins. The environment is first and foremost about knowledge. I believe that this knowledge is not optional. It should be part of the core curriculum. The environmental component must be present in all educational programs, starting from kindergarten. Only then will people's mentality change to understand their personal responsibility for their future, where humankind, that is a geological force these days, can hope to continue to develop sustainably. It is obvious that problems abound in the environmental sphere, and they keep growing, which puts pressure on the situation as a whole and drives up the costs that prices will have to pay later for restoring the balance. Our job today is to preserve the unique nature and diversity of our land for the benefit of future generations. It's time to act. Our future depends only on us. Thank you, friends, and thank you for your attention.
Welcome to this discussion within the Fort Ross Dialogue. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I serve as Secretary of California's Natural Resources Agency. Our mission is to steward or care for the state's natural resources as well as cultural and historic resources. So for that reason, I'm really excited to be here today talking about the historic and contemporary land use practices in relation to the region where Fort Ross is, and then more broadly in California. I want to pass along greetings to our friends in Russia as well as around the world, those who have championed and partnered together to preserve the incredible historic and cultural legacy of Fort Ross, and of course, the friendship and collaboration between Russia and its people and California and its people. Big thanks to Sarah, of course, the Conservancy Director, for organizing this. And I'll also acknowledge and thank former Governor Jerry Brown, who has always been such a champion of these dialogues and reached out to me and asked me to participate here today. So our discussion over the next 45, 50 minutes is going to be an interesting one. We have 3 panelists joining us today, each with a really interesting perspective on land use practices. We have Brendan O'Neill, Senior Environmental Scientist at our State Parks Department. Brendan works in the Sonoma-Mendocino Coast District and is essentially our foremost expert on the natural resources and the environmental resources within Fort Ross and neighboring state parks. We're also joined by Nina Hapner, the Director of Environmental Planning of the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians at Stewart's Point Rancheria. What all of us should know is that Native peoples and Native communities have been stewarding these lands around Fort Ross and throughout California since time immemorial, for thousands of years. And in California state government, we're now acknowledging that traditional leadership and the need to learn from tribal knowledge and partner on exploring ways to better protect and conserve the land. And then last but not least, we're joined by Kaylin Biddle. Kaylin is a youth leader in the Bay Area who's focused on a different aspect of land use practices that Governor Newsom here in California is prioritizing, and that is building our soil health, building the health of the soils that grow our crops and grow our food and fiber. So I'm really excited with this discussion. I want to set the tone a little bit, or at least set some context for the discussion about why Governor Newsom has prioritized nature-based solutions to our environmental challenges here in California. In our state, we pride ourselves on leadership that our policymakers have provided tackling climate change. And that includes expanding the amount of renewable energy generation that powers our economy. That includes improving the efficiency of our buildings and our appliances and our electronics. It also includes a big push to move our transportation system to zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells. And I categorize all those solutions as sort of technology driven solutions. Earlier this year, though, Governor Newsom elevated another critical set of solutions, and that is utilizing our nature, our natural lands and our working lands, our farms and ranches, to address climate change and also achieve other environmental priorities, including maintaining biodiversity, or the natural richness and variety of plants and animals that we have in the state. California is about 100 million acres of land. That translates to about 40 million hectares. 90% of that land is comprised of these natural areas or working lands. So think your forests, your wetlands, your woodlands, your farms, your ranches, your parks. And we have understood or sort of try to prioritize around how can we improve land management for a few reasons. One is to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. We know that trees and land can remove and do remove carbon from the atmosphere. We call that sequestration, nature-based sequestration. How can we improve or optimize our management of land to remove carbon from the atmosphere? And how can we care for our land to build the resilience of California to all of these threats that are getting more challenging with climate change? For example, catastrophic wildfire, drought, and flooding. So how do we manage our lands to remove carbon from the atmosphere, protect ourselves and our natural areas from climate change, and again, maintain that biodiversity? The governor issued an executive order in October that really elevated nature-based solutions as a critical priority and set an interesting and important goal for us, which is to preserve or conserve 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030. We know this as the 30 by 30 goal. And it's part of an international movement to protect 30% of our planet by 2030. International scientists tell us that protecting that amount of our planet, both on land and at sea, is necessary to help avert catastrophic climate change by absorbing more carbon from the atmosphere, but also to avoid this mass extinction or limit this mass extinction crisis where we're losing types of plants and animals across the earth. So Governor Newsom stepped up and said, in California, we're setting our own 30 by 30 goal. And to me, I'm really excited about that because it's a clear numeric target that will galvanize, mobilize us to do more conservation across the state. And this doesn't mean just setting aside land away from people. Our tribal leaders have educated us that people and nature go together, and people have been stewarding nature and conserving nature, again, since time immemorial in California. So we believe that this 30 by 30 is going to mean more conservation through, for example, parks, but also better land use practices through farming, for example, through building the health of our soil. And providing environmental habitat within farms. So we're really excited about this. We at our Natural Resources Agency are sort of a hub for this effort on nature-based solutions. And that's why I'm so excited to be here today and to talk with our panelists. So with that said, I'm going to first turn to Brendan. And again, Brendan is the Senior Environmental Scientist with our State Parks Department. And Brendan, I wanted to ask you to just give us a sense of sort of historic land use practices in this region around Fort Ross on our beautiful northern coast of California. Also sort of what we know about the natural environment there and the life it supports. And then finally, what are sort of the challenges that we're addressing and how do we want to address those challenges? So that's a lot of questions, obviously, and just want to ask you to start to unpack these, and then we can talk more as we get into a conversation. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. Thank you, panel, and thank you, Sarah, and attendees. There's a lot to unpack in that question, and I'll see where we can begin. Fort Ross, I think we can go back to the time of Kashaya-Pomo, and we'll probably circle back with Nina at some point on that. But Fort Ross was the landscape of the Pomo for the Kashaya-Pomo for millennial, and at that time it was managed with light, low-intensity fire, and the Pomo Kashaya lived off the land and used resources at their availability locally. A lot of seafood, shellfish, fish, acorns were a big part of their diet. And tending to that landscape was often done with the use of low intensity and light fire. And the forests had fewer trees, larger trees. There was a bit more grassland than there is today. The ridges would have been absent of trees as they are today. I think that the ocean resources were much more abundant in that time. And that sort of dynamic lived for a long time. And then at some point, I think 1812, our Russians came to Fort Ross, and the fort was at that time an outpost. And forgive me if I get all my facts correct here on these details, but the Russians managed Fort Ross for some time as a supply outpost to help with the settlements in Alaska. And the Russians certainly utilized the resources to the best of their ability there. There was a lot of farming and some tree removal, but limited in their technology. And there was also a considerable amount of game that was removed. In particular, seals and fur trapping was done. following the Russians' departure, we had the ranching era, and that really is when removal of trees and change of the landscape began in earnest. A lot of the initial efforts out there were centered around dairy and some minor logging. But after World War II, when we had the technology to really start removing trees and to harvest the forest there, is when a considerable amount of the large redwoods and some of those beautiful resources were removed for construction of homes in California and other locations. The fort itself became a park in 1906, and then it slowly expanded into the 1990s. The fort today, Fort Ross, consists of 3,300 acres, and it goes from the ocean all the way up to the ridge. And that park has a beautiful array of different resources. There's an incredibly abundant coastline there with kelp forests, which are really important in sequestering carbon and keeping a stable environment. We have a fantastic coastal terrace, coastal prairie with a high biodiversity of wildflowers and grasses, a lot of bird life that exists out there, and a lot of aquatic life that exists within the streams that bisect those terraces. These are also important for carbon sequestration. The soils are really important in there for sequestering carbon. And then as we move up the terrace, we have Bishop pine forests. They're a short-lived, intense, fire-dependent habitat type. And then all the way up to the ridge, we look at redwoods, and we have some beautiful old-growth redwoods in the park, large diameter, just absolutely fantastic forests. And moving up to the ridge tops, some oak woodlands with some fantastic views of the coastline. All these habitats function together, and there's all sorts of interesting connections and networks that happen within there with fungus and invertebrates, flowering plants, wildlife, vertebrate, invertebrates, birds. There's just an array of interdependencies that occur in there. They provide function for clean water, clean air, and for healthy, happy people. And when you call it recreation, it sounds good, but when we call it recreation, then you really start to understand how important that is to humanity. And
Brendan, what with this? That's fascinating. It's a great sort of survey of the environment. What do you, if you had to identify the biggest threat to the sort of the functioning of those incredible ecosystems, what would they be at this point?
It's climate change. We see lots of pathogens that have been introduced in the last few years, stressors that you can start to see in habitat throughout the park units. Everything is much drier. We have about, I think 50% of the fog that we had 20, 30 years ago. Our temperatures are up about 3 or 4 degrees on average across the range. We have great temperature records at Fort Ross. And so that's a little warmer there. But definitely fire and the introduction of pathogens. The kelp forest has had some issues in the last few years. Sea star wasting disease has had a trophic cascade that's impacted many of the organisms off the coast. And then our forests are under threat. Sudden oak death is really limited and in fact created significant mortality with our tan oaks and has impacted our broadleaf forest and our redwood forests. And our pine forests are under attack from a pitch pine canker, which is really devastating to those stands.
Wow. Well, thank you for those opening remarks. That provides a really good background on both the sort of historic land use practices and also just the remarkable environmental richness of Fort Ross and its surroundings. I want to turn next to you, Nina. And as I mentioned, our state government, after I have to say, over 100 years of largely ignoring tribal leadership on natural resources management, is coming around to understanding just how effective tribal communities have been stewarding these lands and how important it is for we in state government in areas like our state parks to really work with and partner with tribal communities to really understand what practices have been working for a very long time. So I'm interested in your perspective on Fort Ross, the region, in land use and sort of both the past, but also opportunities you see moving forward?
So
and I think we may have lost Nina for just a moment. So we'll see if she comes back on. Oh, there she is.
apologies.
No worries, you're back and we can hear you.
Excellent. So I do have a map if you guys would like to see the traditional territory of Kashaya. So I need to share my screen real quick. Please bear with me while this happens.
Take your time.
Can you see the map?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, great. So as you can see, there's a yellow and there's a pink outline of land. So the pink is the current reservation, the Stewart's Point Rancheria, and the golden color is the Kashaya Coastal Reserve. And we share a boundary with Salt Point State Park, and then as you go a little further south here, you have Fort Ross. And so Kashaya they're very much tied to this area. It's Kashaya home. It's Kashaya homeland. And initially, before settlers, Russians, anybody else, Kashaya covered over 38 miles of coastline from Walala down to Salmon Creek towards Bodega, and inland at the longest point, at the widest point, over 19 miles out to what now is called Lake Sonoma. And so we're tied to this region. We may have only jurisdiction, so to speak, or being able to manage effectively what we have here in these two colors, but the tribe keeps an interest in what goes on in this whole area, and certainly along the coast. And as you talk to elders and stuff, they used to say that the ocean is the grocery store. You could get anything that you needed. This sustains you. You have your acorns in the inland, you have your biche, your meat, your deer in the inland, but then you have your sea urchins, you have your abalone, you have your fish, you have all this out here. And so this landscape was really well used. People traveled, people came together, and to have that has been altered so much, and certainly with non-tribal people, Russians, and the Kashaya interacting in those cases, it's changed how we use the landscape, and we've seen the management change. Fires became something that people wanted to suppress, but when they came to this landscape, the whole reason why this landscape was this way was because that was a tool that was used, and that tool was used to help produce healthy plants and healthy landscapes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay. I don't know if you guys still need to see this. That way I can see everybody else.
Very helpful.
Nice. But I thought that might be helpful, especially for people who are not familiar with this area, to have an idea of how much Kashaya covers within this area, and Fort Ross is certainly part of that. Our landscape use has changed. Of course, we've had to change as populations have grown and more people have come into the area, but Kashaya people still utilize the ocean, and they still utilize the resources. And as Brendan spoke, we have a lot of opportunities to begin working together between the state parks and the tribe. We have a memorandum of understanding that now we're able, that we can work together on projects. We've always had that intent, but it has been difficult in the past because you're right, we have been ignored. And I know of times trying to even inform California Fish and Wildlife Service, hey, tribal people are out here, they're seeing these things happen, and to be classified as, oh, well, that's just citizen science. That's not really relevant. But we are relevant. And when people are out there and you're using that landscape and the things that you see happening when a food resource is no longer available, or the migration of a certain thing is happening later or at a different time frame, you note those and you see those. And when you try to explain that to people who are scientists, I'll say scientists, if they're if they're stuck in the four white walls, then we have a problem. We always enjoy working with people who are out on the landscape because you see what's going on, you measure that progress or that demise of something, and we've seen that. Kashaya is excited to have at the Coastal Reserve. We have an area that it's been owned by a family that has logged it and used it for economics. We're excited to take this piece of land that we have and return it back to something that's sustainable, because this current practice on what's going on with that area is not sustainable. And so moving to the future, that's what we really want to do with our resources, is that and build resiliency. And that goes along hand in hand, I think, with climate change. We need to look at how can we make our resources resilient, and how can we bring back the understanding that what you use, there's always got to be a reciprocal process with it. Because I think when we look at land management, we're missing people understanding what it means to have reciprocity. You can't, and we've seen this happen in the past where you've seen the pictures of abalone shells, thousands and thousands of abalone shells, hundreds of otters for their furs. Big trees cut down, the landscape pretty much barren, and it's had some devastating impacts on the forest and on the oceans and on our resources. And so when I look at it from a tribal person and looking based on what tribal management and honestly what state management is, I have some conflicts with how they manage our resources, because they don't have the full story. They have it in the past. And so now we're starting to see changes where, I'll be quite honest and transparent, we have changes in faculty and staff in some of these agencies, different generations. People look at things differently, willing to be more flexible. Well, let's take a look, let's listen. And I won't say that everybody is like that, but we know what it's like to have old timers in office who want to keep it the way that they like it. And then we know what it's like to have progressives. And sometimes progressives are not always the easiest to work with either, but we're starting to find that medium. And we're seeing this as with Kashaya being involved in a lot of collaborations with state park staff. Brendan's great. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do as many things as we want, just because of resources and people resources and now pandemic mode, but we'll get there. We consistently stay in touch, which is great. So we know what's on the horizon and we're excited about it happening. We look forward to being able to collaborate more on the Bishop Pine stuff that they're doing, because we have a boundary with them, and the pathogen does not know the boundary. It's going to cross. And if we can look at being contiguous with our management that benefits our resources, then we might have different goals on what the resources are for the state park and for the tribe. For us, when we look at the Coastal Reserve, we're looking at bringing a forest back to a resilient state that it has. It might encourage endangered species to come back in. That's all right. Maybe eventually we get them taken off the endangered species list if we manage our habitats right. We also look at bringing back where we're missing our food resources and what that forest provides. And same thing with the grasslands. We don't have the grasslands that we've had. They're hugely impacted by non-native grasses. And I could say in some cases, thank you, Spaniards, because you wanted grasses for your horses and you didn't like what we had. But we have to try and find a balance for that. We have a lot of food resources in those grasslands that the tribe has not accessed because it's hard to find them. And we do have small patches of good grasslands that show native grasses, but we don't have enough. And so we look at, well, if we do grazing and we bring in fire as a tool, can we find a balance? We're never going to eradicate the non-natives, but what type of balance can we find so that we have access back to those plant resources? I
have to say,
I could give you so much, but I'll cut myself off.
I mean, it's fascinating. I'll make a couple points. First, just how sort of the historic, practices still impact the lands. You mentioned the introduction by the Spaniards of certain grasses, non-native grasses, that then crowded out the native grasses, and that has real impact on the habitat for animals. But of course, also the food that the native communities were accessing. I also really appreciate the point you make about acknowledging the role of this, what I call anyways, traditional ecological knowledge, or known as TEK. There had been this resistance among state, formally trained scientists to really incorporate those practices as I understand it, that were passed down more orally over centuries and thousands of years versus through sort of traditional Western scientific methods. And so there used to be a certain dismissal, as Nina points out. We've acknowledged now that that's so foolish, because actually it's this long view and this sustained knowledge of the landscape and what's worked and how it's changed that's absolutely essential to understand what we need to do. If you think about California's statehood, 170 years old, that is a mere blip in the natural history of California. So I'm really excited that our state parks is embracing this learning from our tribal leaders through people like Brendan. I want to make sure, and I want to fight for more resources to improve those partnerships, because it just seems like there's so much potential there. I want to shift our conversation to Kaylin Biddle, and we're really excited to have Kaylin here today. She is a high school student, as I mentioned, from the Bay Area, that in exploring sort of how she wants to make her contribution in the world, got involved in recent months, as I understand it, with the Healthy Soils movement. And again, the idea there, and I won't steal sort of her thunder, but is to figure out how we can help our soils in California become more healthy, get more organic matter in those soils, which provides many benefits. So Kaylin, I'm interested to know sort of how you got involved, considering how important it is to have youth leaders, you know, how you got involved, and then also what you guys did as in the Healthy Soils Initiative, and then some sort of key takeaways or sort of conclusions you have from your work.
Thank you so much, Secretary. Hello, my name is Kayla. I'm a 17-year-old high school student from Brentwood in the East Bay Area. Growing up, I was never sure on what career path I wanted or even what interested me. So deciding what to do for the rest of my life at age 18 seems so crucial to my future. And I've always just wanted to make the right decision. I knew that I wanted to make some sort of difference in the world, and I had a passion for environmental science, but I never knew where to start. I felt so inadequate in the impact I was able to make that I began to give up and settle for smaller goals. My mom was worried about me because she knew I was I shouldn't settle for the smaller goals. And my uncle could see how concerned she was, and he owns a company called Pest Tech that offers environmental services, where he offered me a job with my cousin part-time. And this is where my journey of environmental awareness starts. Through working for my uncle, he put me in touch with Sergey, who helped me take my career path in a complete 180, maybe without even knowing it. Sergey is the VP Government Relations with Chemists Without Borders. So working with him over the summer, he had my cousin and I work on building up a 100% recycled planter box. We filled it with yard scraps, leaves, branches, and pigeon manure to start the soil regeneration process. We made a second planter bed and created a wall to retain soil in a small dirt area of the property. Other than what was already at the site, we didn't purchase anything while making this. Since my uncle's business revolves around land management, he wanted to sponsor the unutilized space so we can start our own nonprofit, publicly benefiting garden to give back to the community. Because so many food banks are in need of fresh food, especially in a time of crisis, like now with COVID. Sergey taught us that wanting to make a difference in the world is great, but it's most important to be realistic, because you can only do so much for the 7 billion people. He made me realize that if I was really wanting to make an impactful difference, I should start with the very community I live in. The three of us went out to Fremont, and we visited a friend of Sergey's who runs Leaf, a nonprofit organization that grows food for the local food bank. Seeing the functioning, flourishing garden in person inspired us and showed us that we can do this, and it's not something as abstract as it sounds. We plan on creating this on a smaller scale and replicating it for Antioch and surrounding cities. I was even able to get our first 4 student volunteers to come out and help build. We already have members of the community interested in helping out, which inspires us even more to make this a reality. After constructing some beds and doing what we can with the given space, spray biochar into the soil. Biochar is a charcoal-like substance of organic matter to safely store carbon inside the soil. This is one of the many recycled inputs we have going into this project. The biochar was donated to Tech from the Healthy Soil Alliance, a nonprofit that solves humanitarian problems by mobilizing the global chemistry community and its networks. Just like how we have not spent any money getting this up and running, the biochar was also given to us, so it can be seen as yet another recycled input going into this project. Their goal is working on small-scale soil projects to improve problems we have with our climate by sequestering carbon back into the soil. When you put biochar in the soil to help the plants, you're at the same time keeping the carbon from going back into the atmosphere, making the earth warmer, and changing the climate. I find it extremely important to educate our upcoming youth on the problems we are currently facing environmentally. Incorporating hands-on science where they can grow their own plants to spark passion, and teaching them how to minimize their carbon impact on our planet are a few factors that I feel could make all the difference in the long run. The Fremont Garden I visited does not just grow food for the city, but they offer educational opportunities to unify their community further. Local needs are opportunities to get engaged, make an impact where it's felt, and to grow personally. So I feel offering something like this at the Antioch site would be super impactful. I've always had an interest in problems within our society, like not optimizing what we can do to slow down our carbon footprint or the factory food industry, but I never knew how to get started to help out. So working with Chemists Without Borders has taught me so much. They even had me participate in a youth summit with kids just like me all around the world doing the same thing I'm doing here in my community. It was great to hear and see other kids' interests and experiences, and it gives me hope for the future going forward.
Wow. Well, really powerful. And I think you should, from my perspective anyways, you should be really proud of your work. I think probably many of us would say at 17, we didn't, we were a mere shadow in terms of your direction and initiative. And I really think that your story brings in this international dimension, which of course is at the heart of these Fort Ross dialogues. You talked about and educated us on healthy soils and how we reintroduce, organic content back into the soils as a climate solution. And I have to say, Kaylin, we're really excited to do that in California. As you know, California is a major breadbasket for the rest of the country. And unfortunately, over time, our agricultural practices have focused more on, or I should say less on, bringing that organic content back into the soils for soil health. And our agriculture secretary, a woman named Karen Ross, is really, really passionate about working with farmers across the state to improve the health of soils. And we actually have a healthy soils program where we're putting tens of millions of dollars in incentives to farmers for making this shift. And I'll mention, because we deal a lot with water issues in California, not only is the healthy soils effort good for removing carbon from the atmosphere and preventing that organic content from leaching to the atmosphere, it's really good for water retention. And what we learn is that soil that has more organic content keeps water longer for the benefit of growing plants. And that's, of course, huge in a place like California where we struggle with periodic drought. So I'm really excited with your work. And I think you're a great example of actually literally getting your hands dirty in the community to do something, but then connecting it to the international movement. And it's so exciting to hear about Chemists Without Borders and connecting youth leaders across the world. Maybe a fun question for you is, based on your experience, what do you think is next for you? Whether it's education-wise or, potentially just brainstorming about your career.
I definitely see myself going into this field long term. So, but as of right now, I am hopeful that we can, within the next 2 years, as I'm at junior college, we can get this garden going, as well as doing some work with bees. And we already have that kind of started. The company I work with, they have began donating beehives to schools in San Francisco to getting kids out and incorporating them into working with the bees and the plants. And I think that's awesome. And I would love to do something like that at my location that I'm working with in Antioch, because not only are we trying to help the soil and the earth, but the animals and insects that live on it too. So.
Wow. Well, I have to say, I do a lot of these Zoom conferences, and I rarely get to have time with youth leaders. So it's just really inspirational to hear what you're doing. And I might recommend for Sarah and the Fort Ross Dialogue to do a future dialogue, next year or in future years that's focused on youth leaders. And wouldn't it be such a great idea to have youth leaders from Russia and youth leaders from California talking about sort of, cultural, restoration, but then also all this environmental restoration work that you're doing. So Kaylin, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And of course, I just want to recognize that there's, obviously dimensions around youth leadership, both in the tribal communities. And before we got on, Nina was talking a little bit about young tribal members and the work she does with them. And then also Brendan, State Parks has this remarkable education component, including this online ports program. So there's just a lot of potential there.
Absolutely.
I'd ask you sort of, as we move into sort of our final piece of the discussion here over the next 10 minutes, what would you have our California government do to advance improved land management, either around Fort Ross or generally speaking? I call this sort of a magic wand question. If you had a magic wand, Brendan and Nina and Kaylin, what would government do? And recognizing that this is a dialogue with our friends and colleagues in Russia, I invite you to share any sort of big, ambitious ideas around international collaboration as well. So Brendan, I'll go to you first. You have this magic wand momentarily, a lot of political authority. What is your sort of big, ambitious vision around how our state agencies and governments can help your work?
Wow. The magic wand is a big tool. I haven't had the opportunity to have this conceive of this yet, so you caught me a little off guard. But I know already that the state and you are working on the Green Tape Initiative, which is something that's important for us. And I think that allows us to expedite the permitting and the regulatory review that we've been working with on a lot of our projects that are really critical. And the irony of working in state parks.
I'll just interrupt for a moment to explain to participants that Governor Newsom is passionate about helping us do good things quicker and more cost effectively. We have all sorts of regulations that have been put in place over decades that are well-meaning, but the consequence is it makes it harder and more expensive to do the restoration work that Brendan is leading. So we call it cutting green tape, like cutting red tape, cutting the bureaucracy out of that restoration. Sorry, Brendan.
No, perfect. Thank you for explaining that. So that right there would give us the opportunity to really increase our production and get a lot more stuff done out there. And I would say I spend far too much time in front of a screen and a keyboard getting ready to do the permits and the review that's required for these projects. That said, we also steward a resource that's really important and irreplaceable. And there are a lot of subtleties that need to be examined when we do this work. So I don't want to just dismiss it that we don't need that kind of review, but that would really be a huge help. The ability to partner with folks and to leverage resources and to gather folks. I think we're seeing some new innovations with prescribed fire. There's a program called TREX out there right now that we're working on, where I'm not just working, I'm able to bring a large group of collaborators together to mobilize resources that just didn't exist at all 10 years ago. We're seeing a lot of things like that that are starting to happen. where we are really able to coalesce around these needs and get things happening with, I think, where we're all working with each other. We're sacrificing a little time on our own land, but this synergy that happens when we do these sort of things is really impressive. And it brings a lot of new skills to the table, and it keeps the sort of insular attitudes that we might have in our own organizations from festering, and giving us a larger perspective that's really also helpful in the way we manage landscapes.
Well, that's great. You have my commitment to, one, help you do your work more quickly and cost effectively through that cutting green tape. And then two, finding ways to support these partnerships. And that's a great segue to Nina, because it seems like, we at State Parks and in our agency understand we need to strengthen our partnerships with tribal governments. So Nina, what would you have us do with that proverbial magic wand, or what's a sort of an ambitious vision you have?
That is a very loaded question, right? I think because ideally tribes would like to have unrestricted, basically have access and have the land back. To be quite honest, having the Kashaya Coastal Reserve, the tribe has access to the ocean without having to ask a state park or a private landowner, only talking to their tribe about getting access to the ocean. That's been more than 150 years at this point. So, or 125 years. But I think we're on a path to doing that. As we mentioned earlier, we have an agreement with state parks that will improves our collaboration, being able to work together on projects. But we also have even a newer one about tribal people, Kashaya people, being able to access and utilize state parks without having to pay to go in. That's huge. Many years ago, tribes used to be able to access areas and fish and gather from areas without having to show just having to show their tribal cards. And that changed over the years. I'd really like to be able to get back to that and know that they have their family members to help them with what they need to do. I'm happy to know that people are starting to listen more to tribes. That helps tremendously. And we have 5 tribes in California right now that are working together on a collaborative to put together management strategies to work with the state on. And that's something that we haven't done before, and that's with the assistance of the Ocean Protection Council and SIA and, like I said, 5 tribes that we're coming together to do this. It's just in the beginning stages. We just received the funding. We're excited. We're terrified. But it's a huge step forward. Actually being able to put something down. I think the hardest, what I've learned with dealing with the Coastal Reserve, and let's say with Sonoma County Open Space District, and with anybody in the state, actually, not just them, is when you have conversations about how you want to manage something, all the intentions are good, but I put it in the same effect that we're all speaking English, but we're not talking the same language. So we might be using English to try to describe what we're doing, but understanding exactly how that concept gets implemented isn't quite there. And it's been a learning curve. And it's been nice that the people that we're working with have been really flexible in trying to grasp that and understand that. So for us, trying to convey what that is, knowing what it is and say it just has to be this way because that's the way it should be. And then people who really stick with science, and I'm not saying that science is bad, I'm a scientist by training, but there's flexibility in science. And when you grow up with your relatives being that their science, they know so much more about what's going on than what a scientist, so-called scientist or biologist or ecologist might really know. And so I think we're moving in the right direction with having this flexibility with different entities. Certainly, you have any lands that you would like to get rid of in Kashaya territory, please see us first. We'll take them off your hands because the tribe is doing that.
The governor issued a directive to actually prioritize the transfer of those types of lands back to tribal communities for what it's worth. So.
Well, there we go. That's good. But I mean, ideally, we'd like to have ultimate control over our areas. That's the magic wand with unlimited resources. Of course, we all would like that. Yeah. So, and people to listen.
And I do think that's I'm hoping you'll see more progress from our administration, really digging in and building these true sort of co-management approaches that really respect the authority and the knowledge of the tribal communities, and where we can actually, transferring land back to tribal communities. We've actually lost Kaylin, unfortunately, so it doesn't appear that we're going to get her final words, but she actually ended her talk, I think, in a pretty inspirational way. So as we conclude here in this, I think, final installment of the Fort Ross Dialogue, at least we're in the final day, I just want to thank Brendan and Nina and Kaylin. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, three different but complementary perspectives on really how we manage lands, how we've managed lands in the past, how we're doing it now, and how we can in the future. I'm really optimistic. Obviously, 2020 has been a very difficult year in California and throughout the world, given the pandemic. But there's a lot happening and a lot of really positive collaboration happening within the state and, of course, across the world. So I'm so glad to be part of this Fort Ross Dialogue. I really want to thank Sarah once again for all the work that the Conservancy does. And I'm looking forward to finding ways to collaborate with our Russian colleagues and friends. And as always, deeply, deeply thankful for the Russian government's historic support for Fort Ross as an important cultural legacy here in California and a shared legacy between our countries. So Kaylin, Brendan, Nina, thanks so much for joining. And Sarah, thanks so much for organizing. And I will turn it back to you at this point.
Conservancy, Sarah Sweedler, for being the driving force of this international conference, which aims to find common ground on points of collaboration between different members of Russian and American society. In 1912, the Russian-American company founded Fort Ross in Metini, an ancient Kashaya Pomo locality that welcomed foreigners on their ancestral lands. The multinational society that developed and flourished around the Russian settlement was rooted in deep mutual understanding, where individual religious freedoms were preserved and where respect for different customs thrived. Fort Ross Dialogue strives to continue this tradition of mutual respect, where differences of opinion are honored and where discussions open doors to further cooperation. As we wrap up this international virtual conference, I want to express my sincerest gratitude to our extremely professional production team that used advanced, cutting-edge technical design and visual layout technology to organize this 5-day-long broadcast, which managed to connect speakers from Moscow, California, DC area, and even London. We apologize for any drawbacks in your user experience due to the technical difficulties we have encountered. Yet, thanks to selfless efforts by production director Anton from Webcast Solutions and our incredible team of translators, Alexander and Dmitry, very important discussions did take place. Thank you all for participating in Fort Ross Dialogue 2020. We hope to see you next year in California for another round of important discussions. Until then, I, Igor Polishuk, Fort Ross Conservancy's Director of External Relations, wish you all the best. Sarah, can we turn over to you to hear some final thoughts? Hello.
Thank you, Igor. Well, it's been a really productive and interesting week. We've covered a tremendous amount of territory. I won't take a lot more of your time. I did, of course, also want to thank the tech team and Igor for their fantastic work this week, for all the speakers, of course, who were very generous in their time and expertise, and of course the sponsors, Sovcomflot, Chevron, and Transneft. And while I can say we've learned a lot doing a virtual conference, we've been able to pull in speakers from much farther afield. We've been able to reach a much wider audience with our participants coming from all over the world. There are a lot of upsides to digital. but I can say that in my heart, I really look forward to meeting with all of you, be it in Russia in the spring or California in the fall, and actually being able to have these conversations in person, because I really think those are the lasting connections that we absolutely need to make at this point. So with that, I want to thank all of you again, and I look forward to reconnecting with you in 2021. Take care.